Welcome to the special election edition of the Slingshot. I'm delighted to introduce our latest guest, Isabella Weber. Isabella is an associate professor of economics at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. She works on policy responses to inflation and has advised policymakers in the US and Germany on price stabilization measures. Her first book, How China Escaped Shock Therapy, the Market Reform Debate, won, among other awards, the Joan Robinson Prize. And her next book, Essential: Inflation, Profits, and Survival in an Age of Emergencies, will be published in 2026. She is also the author of Inflation in Times of Overlapping Emergencies, which we will be discussing today, among other topics. Isabella holds a PhD in economics from the New School for Social Research, New York, and a PhD in Development Studies from the University of Cambridge. Welcome, Isabella. We are so excited to have you here.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm really looking forward to this conversation.
Excellent. And let me also welcome my partner in crime, Darren Bush, a professor in the law school that's my dog, the University of Houston. Today's Slingshot is going to focus on three topics. Why consumers are still mad about inflation. What are the presidential candidates proposing to do about inflation? And finally, Isabella's writings and teachings on the subject. So let's move to topic one. Isabella, US voters are still upset about inflation, even though technically prices are not currently rising above normal levels. And they seem to blame Democrats, who wielded control of the White House, of course, during most of the post-COVID inflation period. So my question for you is, do voters have good reason to still be upset about inflation, even if it's technically over?
So I think voters have good reasons to still be upset. I'm not saying therefore they should blame the White House, because the White House is not necessarily the ones who have created this inflation, right? But let me explain why I think people are still upset about inflation. I mean, there are big questions around the ways in which we actually measure inflation, like what kind of inflation you experience, given the kind of expenses that you have as a household, the kind of incomes that you have. I think that Ben Castleman over at the New York Times actually did an excellent piece in digging into some of that, where basically it matters whether you rent your home or you own your home, and whether you have a mortgage that you got before interest rates went up or you do not, and so on, right? Whether you have to pay for daycare or not, whether you are poor and you already bought the cheapest things before inflation happened, and then you were actually hit harder because there is such a thing as cheapflation, right? Which means that some of the cheaper things have been becoming more expensive than the more expensive things. But even if we don't go into the details and the mechanics of how different people are affected differently by inflation, I think it's important to recognize that the inflation that we have experienced is one that really came from the essentials. It came from food, it came from utilities and fuel, it came from housing, transportation, which is all stuff that people cannot do without, right? It's not like you can wake up one day and say like, oh, today I don't feel like eating, right? I'm gonna change my behavior, not eat. I mean, maybe you can do this for one day or two, but I mean, clearly this is not a sustainable strategy, right? Like same with housing, same with utilities, same with transportation. So this means that as these prices go up, you become poorer, at least for some time, for no fault of your own, right? You keep going to work, you do your job, you do your part of the capitalist social contract, but suddenly you're at the shorter end of the stick. You might already have been at the shorter end of the stick before, but even if you kind of were okay before, you now feel like you're worse off for no fault of your own, which I think leaves a big mark on people's relationship to the economy. So even if this situation resolves itself, and even if we take the wage convergence hypothesis at face value, nevertheless, people had that experience where they actually had falling real wages for no fault of their own, and falling wages because of stuff that they cannot do without. And when that happens, I think the trust in the system kind of cracks to some extent. And we have been in a situation where polarization was already extreme. People had already lost trust in the system in many ways. So I think this was kind of adding fuel to fire in a way. And I think this is kind of the dynamic that we have to take very seriously. Maybe one last point. I had a conversation with a government official from Latin America in a country that has a lot of inflation experience. And his reaction was, well, I mean, isn't this totally obvious? For us, it's a kind of unemployment weakens governments, inflation kills. Because if you lose your job, you know that you have lost your job and that you're worse off because you have lost your job. But if you keep going to work, you do your part, and then inflation squeezes you in ways where you're suddenly much worse off, it triggers this kind of anti-system sentiment, which then inevitably will be blamed on the government in power.
Yeah, and so let's stick with that, blaming the government in power. We had the sense, right, that Biden's administration was going to get really clobbered over this inflation. You remember, he was extremely unpopular even before the debate fiasco. And I, as a person, I went over to the White House and tried to, and I begged them to do something about inflation. And their attitude, it was fairly nonchalant. It's like, this is the Federal Reserve's problem. And I feel like we've seen what's happened since. My question for you is, was there anything that Biden or the White House could have done to try to stem the rising tide of prices, or at least even create the appearance that he cared or was trying to do something? Or was it really nothing for him to do?
So I think if we measure against where we were in, let's say, early 2021, then they actually did a lot of unconventional things. Like they did mobilize the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. We have seen the kind of antitrust revival under the leadership of Lina Khan that, of course, is related to inflation. We have seen the supply chain task force, which clearly also was fixing issues that are related to inflation. So there has been a lot of unconventional activity that implicitly acknowledges that it's not just the Fed's problem. But of course, there would have been scope for doing much more. So if we talk about the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, if one had actually bought oil when the oil prices collapsed in 2020, and thereby would have prevented oil companies from reducing capacity in the way in which they did, where then the CEO of Exxon can go on an earnings call and say, we have created this hole in capacity, this massive, massive hole in supply, and now economic activity is picking back up. And guess what? What it's going to do, it creates record refining margins for us, and kind of celebrates that, right? If the Strategic Petroleum Reserve actually had bought when demand and prices were collapsing, it would have prevented that kind of hole from emerging in the first place, in which case that capacity would have stayed online, in which case you would not have seen the same kind of price explosion. So this is kind of the upstream commodity price stabilization stuff that, I mean, the Biden administration finally releasing oil from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, I think, was the right step. But if it had been a more holistic approach of both floor and ceiling, it would have actually also helped in preventing the overshoot of oil prices that we saw. So this is one thing which I think is an important point, because we are living in a world of overlapping emergencies. It is clear that there will be more shocks. As much as I am wholeheartedly in support of a green transition, I think it's pretty clear that there will be bumps on the road. So the question of energy price stability is one that we have to reckon with, and where I think we need more systematic kind of use of buffer stocks. The second point that I would make is that it's fantastic that we have the antitrust revival that we have. But of course, this is kind of a more medium-term structural kind of instrument, right? It's not like effective overnight, where prices are shooting up very fast. So I think there would have been more scope to go in against price gouging. I mean, Trump did a executive order on price gouging. There's no reason why Biden couldn't have done an executive order on price gouging. I think also there would have been scope for windfall profit taxes. I mean, Biden talked about windfall profit taxes, but then like didn't really lean in. I mean, might have also, sorry, now my dog is trying to get in. It might not have been politically viable, but in any case, it's something that they could have done. And I also think that there would have been a lot of scope for kind of creative measures, like, for example, so there would have been scope for windfall profit taxes. I think that there would have also been, I mean, it has been a very serious crisis, right? So I think there would have also been scope for more creative measures where, I mean, one could have recognized that food prices are a real problem. And I would say that food really is the Achilles heel in many ways, because basically there hasn't been any effective measures on food prices. And for example, one thing that I think one could have done is to work with the extremely concentrated grocery industry and define a basket of essentials I mean, the most basic kind of things, like the kind of basket that food banks already have, right? Food banks have to define such baskets all the time. And to then, I mean, have an agreement with these grocery giants that they cannot raise prices on this basket of the most important of the important stuff, which basically uses the fact that you have these obscene levels of corporate concentration, which means that you wouldn't have to deal with like 1 million corner stores, right? You would have to deal with maybe 10 companies, which is pretty manageable. And that's the kind of logic where I think at the end of the day, they were not daring enough. And that could have been the equivalent of Trump's stimulus checks. I mean, that would have been something that voters would have really seen and felt every time they go to the grocery store. They would have known there's a basket of essential stuff where companies are not allowed to increase prices beyond some agreed upon rate of change. And they would have felt like they have actually been protected. And something like that has not happened. And as much as I'm a fan of all the upstream infrastructure investment, green investment stuff, I think it's way too upstream for people to feel in the short run. And I mean, yes, maybe one could have done better messaging around it and whatever. I don't know. I'm not a comms expert. But I think by the nature of it, it's so upstream that most households, most people will not like recognize this as a game changer for the here now.
Yeah. Isabella, you're kind of like talking about rate regulation of certain essential goods. In a sense, just kind of having a fair rate of return that's a sort of a guaranteed price. And one of the other things that we talk about when we talk about those kinds of, sort of regulated industry types of rate regulation is bottlenecks. And in your piece in Project Syndicate, the taking aim at sellers inflation, you mentioned bottlenecks as being one of the problems that it gives rise to sellers inflation. I've written about bottlenecks in the antitrust realm, but I'm kind of curious as to how you see remedies to such bottlenecks, going forward.
Yeah, so I think the problem that we have is that firms that have been going for efficiency as the most important goal in pursuit of profits for a pretty long time have now experienced that actually having these efficiency-oriented just-in-time production networks experience bottlenecks ends up being good for their bottom line, right? So actually turns out that these bottlenecks did not harm them, but that in many cases, prices exploded in ways that it even increased the profitability of the companies that themselves had bottlenecks or of the companies that were using the stuff that was now in short supply. An example is the semiconductor industry, where that ended, I mean, the massive price increases ended up being pretty good for that industry, while at the same time, the short supply of computer chips meant that, I don't know, car producers could only produce as many cars as they had computer chips, which meant that they basically suddenly had this like supply constraint situation, which gave them scope in raising prices in which they would not otherwise have been able to increase prices. And I think this creates a very serious policy challenge because, as I've already said, and I will keep saying that, we are living in a world of overlapping emergencies. Climate change is real. Geopolitical tensions are mounting. We have a massive biodiversity crisis. and so on, you name it, which means that I think there will be more shocks, there will be more supply chain issues to come. And if companies are allowed to profit off of these bottlenecks in the ways in which they have been allowed, then we have a very serious misalignment of the interests of the public, of stable supply and stable prices, and the interests of corporations of reaping whatever maximum profits they can get. So I think what follows from this is that we basically need policy interventions that aim for strategic redundancies in places where, when shortages occur, when bottlenecks occur, that has major systemic implications. And the design of, I mean, there can be different tools with which you can achieve that, but the goal should be strategic redundancies of the stuff that, when it's not available, creates major collateral damage. And we cannot assume that companies will just be creating these strategic redundancies on their own initiative, because they have not learned that having these shortages has created major problems for them. So it would be expecting something that is not aligned with their agenda. So I think it would be kind of, not a reasonable expectation.
Isabella, I want to ask you about economists and their role in either clarifying or obfuscating the situation. It seems like no matter which way you turn, you get a different opinion in the economic environment. The orthodox economists are doing their standard, blaming monetary policy or too much spending. And the heterodox economists might say, no, it's price gouging, firms acting opportunistically to raise prices at a faster rate than their costs are going up, or price coordination. We've heard about the real page, price fixing conspiracy in rentals. But it seems like there's not a lot of consensus to have emerged in the economics community. Just one camp is kind of hunkering down in their view, another camp hunkering down in another view. The San Francisco Fed put out something, said, no, profits weren't really contributing to inflation. Seems like we know where that study is situated. How do we help an audience of normals, non-economists, to kind of sift through this noise that we are generating, kind of see the truth?
Okay, many things in this question. Let me maybe start with the San Francisco study. San Francisco Fed study. So my understanding of that study is that they find that for the most part, markups were constant, right? Which on my mind is not debunking the idea that profits played a role in inflation. Because if you have a cost shock, and we have had massive cost shocks in upstream industries, most prominently, of course, fossil fuels, but also, for example, shipping and other like pretty ubiquitous inputs. If you have such an upstream cost shock and firms manage to protect their markups, this means that their unit profits actually go up. This is a matter of accounting, and the ECB, actually, the European Central Bank, put out a study showing this based on very simple examples for people to follow. Now, maybe to link this to your question of how can we communicate in ways that people can understand, I think this is basically the same phenomenon as when you buy an expensive house or you buy a cheap house and you're paying the same broker fee of 3%. Then in the case of the expensive house, the broker gets a lot of money. In the case of the cheap house, the broker gets not that much money. I mean, it's a bit more complicated than that, but that's the basic intuition behind it, which means that if you can keep your markup, even though costs shot up, that is actually like now selling a more expensive house and having the same cut, right? So with nothing changed on your part. You went to as many viewings as you did before, and so on. And that, I think, is a really, really important point to grasp, and a point that has created an enormous amount of cross-talking in the debate around inflation and profits. So when studies came out, not going to name names, I'm just going to say studies came out that showed that markup increase did not correlate with price increases. Therefore, profits did not play a role in inflation. I am saying, well, therefore, it's true that we have not seen a universal markup explosion, but this does not say that profits didn't play a role in inflation. In the seller's inflation analysis that we have provided, we are thinking about the inflation process basically in 3 stages, where the first stage is what we call the impulse stage. So there is an explosion of prices in systemically important upstream sectors. So for example, explosion in gas and oil. With the price explosion in gas and oil, you get a markup explosion and you get a profit explosion in the fossil fuel industry, right? So that's what happens in one industry at the beginning of the value chain. Then everybody else reacts to this cost shock. And this cost shock itself actually is sending a signal to firms across the economy that now is the time to hike prices. So the cost shock, to some extent, coordinates the price hikes. Now, if all these firms manage to keep their markups where they were before, on average, or let's say at least the majority manages to keep their markups where they were, or let's say some people actually see their markups going down a little, but the cost shock is large enough to offset that, then you can have a situation where profits still account for the larger part of inflation, even though if you do a scatter plot with markup increases against price increases, there may be like a handful of industries at the beginning of the value chain where you actually saw these margin explosions. And in the rest, you might have seen like more or less constant markups and some firms losing out and some other firms doing a bit better. And, you know, so it looks like a cloud. But this doesn't mean that there hasn't been seller's inflation, because seller's inflation is about this stage analysis. So the first stage is impulse. The second stage is propagation, which comes through this these cost shocks coordinating price hikes across the economy. And then the third stage is what we have been calling conflict inflation, where eventually workers start asking for higher wages because they want to reclaim their purchasing power and they don't want to stay in a situation where they lose out in a persistent kind of way, right? So that also means that at the third stage, with the seller's inflation framework, we would actually expect that eventually wages account for a larger share of inflation. But that doesn't mean that the origin of this inflation didn't come from these price and profit spikes in systemically significant sectors and the ability of the majority of the corporate sector to protect its markups and thereby actually increase its unit profits in light of the shock. It just means that eventually workers started fighting back, which is a result of stage 1 and 2 and not the origin of inflation itself.
Yeah. So when it's been a while since I've taught macroeconomics. Thank goodness. And there's when you the simplicity of the graphs that one shows on like the Phillips curve, the trade-off between inflation and unemployment. It shows this sort of elegant simplicity that people don't typically delve into. But it also implies certain remedies and cures when you teach macroeconomics, as you know. But I'm just trying to refresh my own recollections. It's been a while. But it doesn't seem like even if after you graduate from econ, a lot of those folks who practice economics still are stuck with those tools, and I include in that the Fed, which seems to be more demand-driven tools versus demand-driven inflationary tools versus sellers inflation tools. So that's all a way of leading you to this question of what additional tools do the Fed need to recognize that they have or should have?
Yeah, so I mean, we basically came out of a world where rich countries had the luxury that they didn't have to worry too much about inflation, right? And I'm very consciously saying rich countries here because when we say, oh, inflation suddenly returned in 2021, we are kind of abstracting away from the majority of people living on this planet who have been struggling with all sorts of inflationary episodes and all sorts of overlapping emergencies in the global south for the most part, right? And who, by the way, have been advised to use the kind of macroeconomics that you just described to deal with inflations that, for the most part, I mean, not always and not universally, but often had to do with external shocks, with commodity price shocks, with exchange rate shocks, and so on, right? But nevertheless, in rich countries, in the OECD countries, we came from this perspective where basically inflation was a demand side problem. And since we didn't really have inflation, it also didn't really matter all that much. That this was kind of the assumption that everybody had on their minds, right? Now, I think that in that regard, we actually have seen some major shift in thinking in recent years, in the sense that if we look back to where the debate was in 2021 to where we are now, I think the degree of acceptance that sector level supply shocks were important for inflation is much, much greater than it was before this whole inflationary bout. Even like the Blanchard-Bernanke paper, which I would say is kind of the mainstream gold standard interpretation of this inflation right now. I mean, the decomposition that they do, they show that it's basically food prices, energy prices, and this obscure variable that they call shortages, which I mean, I think is bottlenecks and all the things that we are talking about, right? So even and the vacancies measure, like is vacancy over unemployment measure, plays a much smaller role. So I think we have come a long way in acknowledging both the importance of specific prices for overall inflation and supply shocks for overall inflation. Now, that, of course, leaves us in a situation where central banks have been institutionalized to fight demand-driven inflation and are the major tool to fight inflation. So, I mean, if I was a central bank governor and all I had was a hammer, I would probably think that everything looks like a nail, right? So it's like kind of that problem, right? So that's why I think we need to expand the toolbox, and we need to expand the constituencies, if you want, so that have something to contribute to price stability. And I think that in the way in which we design industrial policy, I'm all for the revival of industrial policy, but I think we should think very systematically about the ways in which we can build price stabilizing mechanisms into the ways in which we do large-scale investments, into the ways in which we rebuild certain industries. And I'm happy to be more specific, but that's like kind of where I'm coming from in terms of big picture response to your question.
No, that's very helpful. Let's use that as a way to transition to our second topic, which is the presidential campaign and sticking with inflation. But I'm trying to study that nexus. We have two candidates, and one really doesn't give us a lot to talk about, so I'll just raise it and then we'll move on. But Trump, I think, is blaming immigrants for inflation, at least with respect to rental inflation. I don't really understand the theory very much, but and I don't even know if conservative economists subscribe to that. But there's not a lot to do with that one, at least from an economics matter. But we can, I think, sink our teeth into Harris's proposal, or at least initial proposal of banning price gouging at the federal level. Now, after she launched that, this was at the beginning of her campaign, she was attacked by neoliberal pundits. I'm remembering Catherine Rampell in the Washington Post saying that the idea smacked of communism, and she seems to have gotten off that a bit. But let's just assume she's still there. Is that a good idea, the price gouging ban? And if so, why? What do you think about it?
Yeah, so I think that the federal price gouging legislation would be extremely important. Basically, it would mean that firms that engage in excessive pricing, at least in situations of emergencies, would have to fear some penalties for that kind of pricing behavior. Typically, price gouging laws are focused on essentials. She is proposing to do the price gouging ban for food, which, I mean, as I've said, I think is the most important category where we have not seen a lot of policy action. So I think the focus on food is in principle correct. I think we also should not necessarily limit ourselves to food, but if I had to only pick one, I would also pick food. And I think that there is an enormous amount of misunderstanding around what price gouging laws actually are. So, I mean, what we have seen is that as soon as she came out with it, the usual economics commentators said, oh, now she's promoting price controls, right? Where on my mind, price gouging laws are not price controls in the traditional sense of the word, because what they do is not to say, generally, you cannot raise your prices by more than X, or you have to keep your prices at Y. But what they say is that in a situation of emergencies, if you increase prices by more than is justified by costs, that can get you into trouble. And the state actually has the ability to look into whether you did such excessive pricing. And this means that there could be actual legal penalties or at least reputational damage for that kind of behavior. Which means that this is not about preventing any kind of price increase. If we take the airport example that has been widely discussed in the context of the recent hurricanes, then this is not about saying airlines cannot increase prices such as to offset the extra costs that they have to bring airplanes to airports that are like in areas that are likely to be affected by a hurricane. But this is to say that they cannot just keep increasing prices beyond what is justified by costs, and where it's clear that the airport has a certain given capacity, right? I mean, you can make workers work longer, you can keep the airport open 24 hours, but eventually you hit capacity, right? And that capacity is fixed in the short run. So eventually, if you just keep increasing prices, you are not actually processing more airplanes, but you are basically rationing the limited availability of flights out of a disaster-stricken area by price, which is, I think, the most unjust form of rationing in a situation of disaster. I mean, if as a society we were to sit down and decide how we should be rationing, I don't think we would come up with the idea that whoever has most money should be the one who gets out of of a disaster-stricken area, unless we were a council of billionaires. But it's also, of course, a situation where you allow companies to profit massively from disasters, which, as I've said before, I think is a real problem in a world of overlapping emergencies in terms of the alignment of public and private interests. So even if you were in that case to just keep airline tickets wherever they have to be, accounting for an increase in cost, and then like randomly whoever is on the website first gets the airline ticket, because in that case we actually would not have any queuing or all the like ideas that then pop up, I think would be still fairer than saying whoever can pay 100 times the normal price now has a chance to get out of the area and others don't. So that is to say, in this kind of situation, I think price gouging legislation makes all the sense of the word. Now, the problem is, of course, that so far, price gouging legislation is state legislation, but disasters can be national, they can even be global. And companies that are responding to these disasters are, for the most part, nationally operating companies, right? So if we only have state law to deal with a national issue, I mean, clearly that is, and you guys are the lawyers, you can put this more eloquently than I can, but I mean, from where I sit as a simple economist, that doesn't seem like a good match to me. What to me was the most disturbing part about this mid-August 2024 episode is that, speaking with a German accent, as you can hear, I am very terrified about a Trump 2.0. And I mean, we were in this horrible situation already before the debate, and then the debate, and I think it was extremely depressing. And then finally we had this change of guards that gave us some hope, right? And then the first economic policy that Harris is coming out with, which happens to be one that that is affirmed by the majority of voters, as we have seen in most recent polls. The majority of voters in swing states, the majority of swing voters, and she comes out with something that really speaks to their concerns. And then the first thing that the majority of economists and the kind of economic pundits you mentioned do is to beat her up for it. And for me, this is seriously anti-democratic. Even if you think that this is not the best economic policy in that kind of a moment, I mean, this is basically an implicit support for Trump, which, given all the things that Trump is saying he will do, is just truly disturbing to me. On a kind of on a personal, moral level, as someone who grew up in Nuremberg, I mean, it's truly disturbing to me. Maybe one more thing on Trump. So, I mean, of course, he doesn't have a coherent set of policies, what he's going to do against inflation. But after he blamed Harris for being a communist, for arguing for federal price gouging legislation, he, of course, did come out with a proposal of capping interest rates on credit card debt, right? And he does say that the moment he comes into power, energy prices will be falling. And I mean, it's a kind of a Deus ex machina, right? It's like completely unclear how this is going to happen. But I mean, the one thing that I could imagine him doing is issue an executive order that somehow forces company to bring down prices, right? And I mean, if it's not that specific to it, then still like the idea that him coming into office makes prices go down. I mean, if this is not like some sort of government price control, then I don't know what it is. So basically, he managed to scare Harris away from the most popular economic policy, where it's very clear that economy and inflation is the thing that people are most worried about, just to come around and basically make, I mean, very incoherent and not as well thought out, and not like sophisticated, but still appealing to the same basic notion kind of proposals, right?
So, it's interesting when you talk about how economists rush in to say that price gouging legislation is bad. And they use very simple, simplistic, and not at all realistic examples of this. So, for example, I think in the Wall Street Journal, press where there's an opinion piece, right? Price gouging is good. It allows supply, allows for entry, because the price signal, allows for entry. And as you pointed out, I think in a post on Twitter or X, that assumes that there's time for that, and assumes there's capacity, right? Otherwise, there's no ability for a price response. And then another economist, whose name I won't mention, says, well, people are so afraid of price gouging statutes that they'll just shut down in a hurricane versus selling goods, which seems totally uneconomic and irrational. So, and I don't think most businesses actually know about price gouging legislation anyway. So their examples are very, very sort of cut and dry on that point. But I have another question about price gouging that that kind of stems from this airline example that we had on social media. So American Airlines offered some A321s and some 737s going into Tampa, and someone wrote, "Aha, a price response." And then someone else wrote, "Well, they weren't price gouging." So it was some excess of demand that without increases in price that allowed for entry. And if that's the case, then doesn't that kill the defense of the economist's defense against price gouging legislation? You can actually have an increased demand, and they're claiming that prices didn't go up, and you could still be profitable entering at those prices. Or does that show that there's monopoly power?
Yeah, I mean, again, I think like the main point here is that price gouging legislation is not about preventing any kind of price increase, right? So if it does increase costs to add capacity in the short run, companies should be able to charge more, right? So we don't want them to be under the impression that they're actually going to take a hit for moving more capacity there. And I think this has never been, I mean, this has never been even on the table, right? This is like not even part of what we are talking about here. So I think this is kind of a gaslighting type of argument. The point on time is just to say that basically, I mean, as I've tried to illustrate based on the airport example, in the short run, capacity is limited, right? And if we, I mean, especially if we talk about something like airports, or let alone new companies moving into the airline industry, I mean, I have to start laughing because, I mean, we know how long it takes to build an aircraft, right? How long it takes to actually start an airline. Like, I mean, this is not something that you do in the span of 2 days, right? This is something that, like, I mean, first of all, rarely ever happens. And if it does happen, it's like a major business undertaking, right? So the idea that companies would somehow crowd into the airline market overnight is, of course, completely unrealistic. And by the way, airports, for the most part, are public infrastructure. So it's not like they're like these private companies that have pop-up airports that emerge in response to exploding prices in the middle of a crisis, right? So, I mean, that whole situation just suggests that by sticking with this basic logic gets you into a dead end. But I will also say that actually part of this you can't even show in a supply-demand diagram, right? You can't just have a supply curve that at some point becomes completely inelastic and is a vertical line, in which case when demand keeps going up, prices will keep going up, but supply will go up by 0, which is basically the situation that we have, right? So you do not even need to give up on your basic neoclassical economics to see that you can have a very serious problem. And that is where I get really frustrated, because I feel like then we are just caught up in some ideological notions, and it's not even about neoclassical versus heterodox or anything like that. It's just about whether you presume that everything is always great as long as it's free market, or you don't presume that.
Let me ask you one last question on the election before we turn to your article. There has been, of course, Trump has been proposing to raise tariffs, not just on China, but across the board as a way to, I guess, generate revenues for the government. And the neoliberal economists have just gone completely insane over this, asserting that it will contribute to inflation because foreign manufacturers will just pass along those tariff increases in the form of higher prices. So it'll be borne mostly by US consumers. I have 2 questions right on this. I mean, is that, are you buying that as an economic matter? And 2, assuming it is right, does that resonate at all with any voters? Do you think that's turning any voters off of Trump, for neoliberals to kind of focus their energy so much on that topic?
Yeah, so in terms of the economics, I mean, a massive tariff shock is basically a cost shock, right? Because now companies have to pay high tariffs, which, I mean, is a cost shock on everything. So I would expect that would function pretty much similarly to an energy price shock or shipping price shock. I mean, we have a paper by the IMF that shows that the massive freight rate increases have been a very significant inflation driver in the recent inflation bout. I mean, basically, when we talk about tariffs, we are talking about stuff that is coming in with ships, right? So I don't see why a massive increase in freight rates would be systematically different from a massive increase in tariffs. So I do think that these kind of crazy increases in tariffs might very well be inflationary. And I don't think that companies are likely to absorb this cost shock because it's the exact same kind of economy-wide cost shock that everybody knows about, that happens at once, that opens up a window of opportunity to increase prices in ways that protects your markups and increases your unit profits. So on that one, I guess I am with the neoliberal economists, probably for slightly different reasons on the part of the transmission from the cost increase to the final price increase, but still ultimately with the same effect. And I mean, by the way, if they assume that a tariff shock induces inflation, then they should also assume that any other upstream input price shock should induce inflation, because it's basically the same kind of problem, right? In terms of voters, it's hard for me to tell. I mean, I think that there is a very deep sense of fear, which I think has to do with many things, including the inflation experience and the ways in which essential prices exploded, as I've been laying out in the beginning of this conversation. And I think that due to decades and decades of cultivating an equation of nationalism with safety somehow. I mean, this is a discourse that is very, very long standing, right? So that I think there is a tendency for people to think that if we do protectionism, it somehow like addresses the deep fears that they have, whether this is actually the case or not. So I feel like, I mean, it might potentially appeal to voters, but probably for all the wrong reasons.
So let's turn to your our third topic, which is your article, inflation in times of overlapping emergencies, which I think is the story of my life. So one of the things you mentioned in there is buffer stocks as a mechanism to control price instabilities. For example, the Strategic Petroleum Reserve could be used to stabilize supply. But so two questions on this one is, one is, what if it's a perishable good? So that's the first question, because in that case, buffer stocks are a little bit more tricky. And the second question is in terms of industries in which there is sort of a singular plant or singular supply source. We see this in pharmaceuticals, the bottlenecks we've talked about before, where we could actually, so that the owner of that plant could actually undo the good of having the buffer stock.
Yeah, so maybe quickly to put this paper into perspective, basically what we did there is to do a stress testing analysis where we have an input-output setting and we shock one sector at a time with a price spike, and then look at what is the total inflation impact that comes both from the direct impact that just comes because now that price in the CPI is higher, so therefore the CPI goes up, and the indirect impact that comes from this initial price increase being passed on by firms across the production network, so that also other prices go up as a result of this initial price increase. And we then ranked the sectors in this input-output table, which has 72 sectors, based on what is the largest inflation impact that these price spikes generate. And this way, we identify sectors that have the greatest potential to unleash inflation. So in other words, we are saying not all prices are created equally, but there are some points of vulnerability where when prices in these sectors go up, the likelihood of it generating inflation is much larger than if the prices in some other parts of the economy go up. And by and large, these sectors fall into three categories. The first is basics of human livelihoods. We have already talked about this. So this is basically about food, agriculture, housing, utilities. The second is basics of production, which is, again, basically energy, but also for example, chemicals, which is in pretty much all production processes. And the third one is the basic infrastructure of circulation of goods. So, for example, warehousing, which is like, again, in pretty much everything, right? So the idea is that in these kind of sectors, we have to come up with sectoral strategies to avoid excessive price volatility. The idea is not to freeze those prices, but to prevent excessive price over and also undershooting. And buffer stocks are basically similar to the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. So the idea is that they would be doing open market operations where they participate in the market for these goods and will be buying when the prices collapse and selling when the prices explode too much, and thereby like have this like countervailing effect, right? Just to kind of, I'm not assuming that everybody knows what a buffer stock is and how it operates. So that's like kind of the very basics. Now, of course, it's much easier to do this for something like oil, which is very storable and also very homogeneous, right? Than it is to do this for something like grain. Nonetheless, if we look at the global food markets and we look at what happened in 2022, when we did not actually have major shortages or not even any like significant shortages on global markets in food staples like basic grains, because the decline in exports from Ukraine and Russia was offset by more exports from other parts of the world. Nonetheless, we have seen price increases that triggered we have seen commodity price increases for food commodities that triggered food price inflation around the world. And we know that the transmission from commodity prices to final food price inflation is much higher in the global south than in the global north. So it hit the global south particularly hard. And it also is the case that, of course, the poorer you are, the more money you spend on food. This is already the case in the US, where the bottom 10%, I think, spend around 30% of their income on food, and the top 10% less than 10%. If you go to developing countries, you can easily find situations where people are spending more than 60% of their income on food. Now, this means that if these kind of prices explode, that has a very immediate impact, not just on the poorest of the poor in rich countries, but on the macroeconomic stability of whole nations in the global south. Okay, so this is kind of the problem that we face, right? I'm just spelling this out because I agree that it's difficult to do buffer stocks for perishable goods, but the problem that we face is gigantic. And I think it's very clear that in a context of climate change, there will be more shocks to come, especially with regard to agriculture and food crops. So the idea with having a buffer stock is that ideally it should serve two purposes. The first purpose is the stabilization purpose that I've talked about. The second purpose is to actually also encourage the planting of more climate resilient kinds of crops and of climate mitigation, adaptation, friendly agricultural practices. Because basically, if you have a buffer stock, you have a massive public procurement instrument, and public procurement is a key tool in industrial policy. And we have a major issue in trying to bring agriculture into green industrial policy, right? We basically are really lacking concepts there. So yes, it is technically not trivial to do buffer stocks for perishable goods, but I think the potential gains are such that it's worth looking into. And I mean, some storage of these perishable things has to happen in any case. It's just that currently it's in the hand of gigantic corporations. The ABCD, 4 companies control between 70 and 90% of global food commodity trade. They have storage that is often larger than the storage of large countries, just the company itself. It's also extremely intransparent. We have talked about increasing the transparency of private storage for decades. There was some momentum after the previous world food price crisis, but we haven't really gotten to a situation of transparency. So yes, it's not an easy thing to pull off, but the problem that we are facing is gigantic. It's a problem of literally human lives. Like in the span of just 2 years, the progress of 15 years in progress in the fight against global hunger was erased, just like that. Like we are back to where we were 15 years prior. And it's also about macroeconomic stability, because when food prices explode, it means for import-dependent countries that the exchange rates collapse. If we then in the global north fight an inflation that has a major component that comes from food by hiking interest rates, we are also exacerbating the debt crisis in the global south. So this basically means that, I mean, the majority of people on that planet kind of become collateral damage of our monetary policy. And I think that is just an untenable situation. It's already been untenable now. And I think looking ahead at how climate change is likely to interact with agriculture, I think we just urgently need to come up with new tools, even if it's hard.
Let me ask, how is this idea that's being peddled in this article being received in policy circles? And then I guess separately, how is it being received in economic circles? And does it even matter how it's being received in economic circles? I can just imagine, but how is it in those two circles?
Yeah, so I mean, by and large, I have been surprised by how much take-up there has been for this article. The title of the article is Towards a Post-Neoliberal Stabilization Paradigm, and we basically go through the history of buffer stock ideas as part of macroeconomic stabilization, going back to Keynes and Benjamin Graham and so on, that were arguing for this for the initial Bretton Woods institutions. And then the new international economic order debates in the 1970s, and where buffer stocks were part, I mean, really at the core of the agenda. So it's in a way like a pretty historical and theoretical kind of paper, which then uses the example of food to spell out what we mean with buffer stock stabilization. And I have been surprised by how much debate it has unleashed. There has been a lot of media coverage. I have been talking to a number of people in the policy world, both on the international level as well as on the national level. And my take is that when you look at critical minerals, it's, for example, in the Draghi report that we need buffer stocks. When you look at what has happened with the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, I think the next step of using the Strategic Petroleum Reserve a little bit more strategically is kind of an obvious one. So I think it's quite likely that these type of mechanisms will be put forward for the energy sector, where, of course, this also has an immediate impact on external competitiveness for firms and an immediate security implication. I think it's less likely for it to come through for food, which is basically, I mean, of course, food is more perishable, and that is a technical issue one has to deal with, but also it is stored, like food staples are storable, and we are in a world where we have techniques to store them. And if you have sufficient rollover, it is possible to do it. The Chinese, by the way, are doing it on a large scale, and the Chinese basically didn't have any food price inflation at all, even though they are not entirely self-sufficient. So what I think is likely is that we get a lot of buffer stocks for security and energy, and that we get much less buffer stocks for food because of political economy reasons. But I think it's still worth fighting for the food part of the story.
Got it. So this is the last question, I promise. And that is, what's next for you? And in particular, we know the book is coming out, Essential Inflation, Profits, and Survival in the Age of Emergencies. But any other hints you can give us as to like exciting research topics, or where are we going to read about you next?
Yeah, so the book is really, I mean, it's not like your classic inflation book, like here's what happened from 2021 to 2024, which I've been telling people on podcasts for 3 years now, every week. So it's more like kind of taking a step back and asking the question of how essential sectors need to be organized to both prevent inflation, but also, I mean, quite literally quite literally ensure survival. So the food buffer stock story that we have just been talking about is part of that logic, right? Where I'm increasingly convinced the more I study that these kind of institutions are necessary, quite literally, for survival, but not only survival of human beings, but also survival of governance systems and democracy. This is the main project that I'm working on. I'm still in the middle of writing, so bear with me. There's a number of other papers that we are working on that are follow-ups of some of the work that has already come out. There's one paper in which we look at the inequality implications of specific price hikes. So we are looking at what are the systemically important prices for inequality, that like when these prices go up, inequality goes up by the most. So it's a kind of a Gini elasticity of price increases, and again, ranking them by sectors, where my thinking is that we need to broaden the inequality conversation from an only monetary conversation to a conversation around the implications of specific sectors, which is very much aligned with the idea of essentials in the book. Then we are working on a paper on Mexico, where we are replicating the systemically significant price analysis for Mexico, and trying to look at what the government there did in terms of pretty unconventional measures in dealing with inflation, and also trying to get at how this kind of inflation is presenting itself to a developing country, as opposed to the world's most powerful economy, the US. And then in a third paper, we are again doing this kind of systemically significant prices analysis, where we are looking at China. So I'm actually going back to my China work, and we are looking at how China is managing its systemically significant prices, how this intersects with inflation and with competitiveness questions. And as a final line of work, we are working on the inflationary implications of carbon prices, and how, this is more of a European project because I don't see carbon prices happening anytime soon in the US. But how, if we exclusively rely on carbon prices for a green transition, we risk being caught up in like carbon price induced inflation, to which we respond by hiking interest rates, with which we increase the capital costs and make the investments that we need for the green transition more expensive and slow them down, in order to become more vulnerable to future climate shocks, which then might again induce inflation. If we respond to that again with interest rate hikes, then we make our ability to deal effectively with the green transition even create even more weakness on that front. So that's another big line of work, where I'm basically trying to bring the question of stabilization policies and the need for a new stabilization toolbox together with the question of transformation, so that we no longer have a stabilization regime that undermines transformation, and transformation policies that do not have stabilizing effects.
All right. Well, thank you so much for being here. Everyone, this is Isabella Weber, and we really enjoyed your time, and we're excited to post it and excited to keep following you on Twitter and all your other writings. So keep kicking butt.
Thank you very much for having me. It's been a lot of fun. Thank you.
Yeah, it's been a blast.